The lot on Norton Avenue sat empty that January morning. A flat stretch of weedy grass between two unfinished houses, with the gray Lowe's Angels sky pressing down on it like a wet cotton sheet. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The year was 1947, and the neighborhood of Lamert Park was still half-built, full of empty squares of dirt where the developers had run out of money during the war. Tall, mustard weeds grew waist-high in the vacant lots. The sidewalks were new and bright, the curbs still sharp at the corners, and the streets smelled faintly of fresh tar. A young mother named Betty Bersinger was walking her 3-year-old daughter to the shoe repair shop that morning. The hour was just past 10. The light was soft and pale, the kind of winter light that turns the whole city the color of an old photograph. As she crossed the lot at the corner of Norton and 39th, she glanced toward the grass, and at first she thought someone had dumped a broken store mannequin in the weeds. It was so white it looked like marble, smooth and clean and strangely posed, with the arms raised above the head and the legs spread apart in a careful, deliberate way. Betty took another step. Then she understood what she was looking at, and her body went cold all the way down to her shoes. The young woman in the grass had been cut in half at the waist. The two halves lay about a foot apart, arranged with a kind of awful neatness, as though someone had set the body down with great care, and then stepped back to admire the work. The face had been marked at the corners of the mouth, 2 long slits drawn upward toward the ears, giving her a permanent, frozen smile. Her dark hair was washed clean and combed. There was no blood in the grass. There was no blood anywhere. Betty ran to the nearest house, scooped up her daughter, and called the police from a stranger's kitchen. Within an hour, the lot was swarming. Reporters arrived before the homicide detectives did, tipped off by friends inside the newsroom of the Lowe's Angels Examiner. Photographers crouched in the weeds. Patrol officers stretched ropes between wooden stakes. A crowd gathered along the sidewalk, neighbors in housecoats and milkmen in white uniforms, all staring at the white shape in the grass. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She had soft, dark curls and pale skin, and a habit of wearing black dresses with little white flowers tucked behind her ear. The newspapers, hungry for a name that would sell papers for weeks, called her the Black Dahlia. The nickname stuck like wet paint. It is the only name most people remember now, almost 80 years later. The case became the most famous unsolved murder in American history. More than 150 people confessed to it over the decades. Detectives traveled across the country chasing leads. The LAPD opened a file that would eventually grow to thousands of pages, full of witness statements and tip sheets and photographs locked in steel cabinets downtown. And yet, in all that paper, in all those years, no one was ever charged. No one was ever tried. The killer simply walked away from that empty lot on Norton Avenue and disappeared into the city like smoke pulled through a window. That is the story most people know. A pretty girl, a terrible morning, a mystery that never closed. But there is another story underneath it, and that other story is the one we are going to sit with tonight. Because almost from the beginning, the men who worked this case began to whisper the same name to each other in quiet hallways. A name that belonged to a wealthy doctor with a big Spanish house on a hill above Hollywood. A man with surgical training, with strange habits, with powerful friends, and with a daughter who would one day tell investigators things she had seen as a child. A man whose own son, a retired LAPD detective, would later spend the last years of his life trying to prove what his father had done. The LAPD knew the name. They had it in their files. They had recordings of his voice. They had witnesses placing him with Elizabeth Short. And then, somehow, the file went quiet. The recordings vanished. The witnesses changed their minds. This is the story of the field where she was found, and the man the police refused to arrest. Before she was a legend, she was a girl named Elizabeth. Most people called her Betty. She was born in the summer of 1924 in a small house in Boston where the salt wind blew in from the harbor and the trolleys clattered down narrow streets. The world she came into was a tired one. The Great War had ended just a few years before, and the country was still trying to remember how to breathe. Her town smelled of coal smoke and wet brick and the briny mud of the bay. Betty was the third of 5 sisters. Her father built miniature golf courses of all things. He was a dreamer who chased money the way a child chases fireflies, never quite catching enough of it. The family lived in a tall wooden house with peeling paint and creaking floors. In winter, frost climbed the inside of the windows like white lace. The girls slept 2 to a bed and shared one wool coat between them when the snow came. Then, one morning in 1930, her father drove his car to a bridge and left it there. His hat was found on the seat. The papers said he had jumped. For years, the family believed he was dead. But he wasn't dead. He had simply walked away west into a new life, leaving his wife and 5 daughters to figure out the rest. Betty grew up in the shadow of that empty chair at the table. She grew up in a Boston of brownstones and cobblestones, of corner druggists with marble counters, and soda fountains that hissed and fizzed. She walked to school past brick row houses with green shutters, past Catholic churches whose bells rang out across the cold harbor. She wore hand-me-down dresses and shoes with cardboard tucked inside to cover the holes. Money was a rumor in her house. Beauty, though beauty she had in spades. By the time she was 15, people on the street turned to look at her. She had hair like spilled ink and skin the color of fresh cream. Her eyes were a soft, startled blue, the color of a winter sky at dawn. She had a way of tilting her chin when she laughed, as if she were posing for a camera that wasn't there yet. She wanted that camera. She wanted it more than anything. The world she lived in was a world of movie houses. On Saturdays, for a dime, you could sit in a velvet seat under a painted ceiling and watch Rita Hayworth dance across a silver screen. The theaters had names like the Strand and the Paramount and the Orpheum, and their marquees blazed with bulbs that turned the wet sidewalks into rivers of gold. Betty went whenever she could scrape together the change. She would sit in the dark and breathe in the popcorn and the perfume of strangers and dream of California. Her health was poor. Asthma had wrapped itself around her lungs like ivy around a fence post. The doctors told her mother that Betty needed warm, dry air. Florida in the winter, the desert when she could manage it. So Betty began to travel, young and alone, riding trains down the long eastern seaboard with a small suitcase and a few dollars sewn into her coat. She waited tables in Miami. She sold movie tickets in a little booth in Massachusetts. She wrote letters home in a careful, looping hand, telling her mother she was fine, telling her sisters she would be famous one day. The letters smelled faintly of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke. Then came the war. The whole country shifted on its feet. Soldiers and sailors crowded every train platform, their uniforms crisp, their faces young and unknowing. Betty fell in love with one of them, a flyer with a wide grin and steady hands. He gave her a ring. He climbed into a plane and never came back to her in the way she had hoped. The grief sat on her chest like a wet blanket. She kept moving. Chicago, Long Beach, Santa Barbara. She drifted west the way a leaf drifts down a stream slowly, but always in the same direction. And the direction was Hollywood, the place where girls with ink-dark hair and winter sky eyes went to become something more than themselves. The place that pulled them in like moths to a porch light, then sometimes forgot to let them leave. By the autumn of 1946, Betty Short was 22 years old, broke, beautiful, and a long way from Boston. She had no idea she had only a few months left. Neither did the city she was about to walk into. The Hollywood that pulled Elizabeth Short across the country was not a place. It was a fever. It lived in the neon signs along Hollywood Boulevard and in the smell of jasmine that drifted off the canyons at night. It lived in the slow grind of streetcars on Wilshire and the low buzz of bar talk after midnight. And it ate young women like her by the dozen. To understand what happened to her, you have to understand the people who moved through those streets in 1946. They were a strange mix. Soldiers home from the war with money in their pockets and ghosts behind their eyes. Studio men in cream-colored suits who carried small black books full of names. Cops who worked for the city by day and for someone else by night. Doctors with private clinics tucked behind ivy gates. And girls, thousands of girls, all of them looking for the same door, and all of them being pointed toward the same back rooms. Picture Hollywood Boulevard on a warm winter night. The palm trees stand black against a sky, the color of an old bruise. The sidewalks shine from a brief rain. Cadillacs glide past, long and slow, their chrome catching the marquee lights of the Pantages and the Egyptian. Drugstore counters glow yellow through plate glass windows. Inside, you can see them. Girls in cheap coats sipping coffee for hours, waiting for a man with a card to walk in and call their name. Elizabeth knew that street well. She drifted between the Formosa Cafe, the Florentine Gardens, and a small place called Brittingham's near the radio studios. She borrowed beds and couches. She kept her suitcase packed. Her closest friends were other girls just like her. Anne Toth, a tall brunette who shared rooms with her. Lynn Martin, only 15 years old and already passing for 20. Marjorie Graham, who lent her stockings she could not afford to give back. Then there were the men, the ones whose names kept rising to the surface of the story. Mark Hansen, a Danish nightclub owner who ran the Florentine Gardens and rented rooms in the house behind it. He was a heavy man with a heavy voice and heavy keys jangling in his pocket. Elizabeth had stayed in one of his back rooms. He liked her by all accounts. She did not like him back. That fact alone would haunt the case for decades. Robert Manley, called Red by everyone who knew him, was a traveling salesman with curly hair and a wife at home in Huntington Park. He drove a coupe and wore suits a size too large. He met Elizabeth on a street corner in San Diego and would be the last person to see her alive in any way the police could prove. He was a small man caught in a very big story, and the story would chew him to pieces. And then, hanging at the edge of every gathering, every party, every late night drive into the hills, were the doctors. Hollywood was full of them in those years. Men with private practices and private patients. Men who handled the things the studios could not let the newspapers print. They worked out of clinics on Sunset and homes in the Hollywood Hills. They charged in cash. They asked few questions. One of them, a tall surgeon with a thin mustache and a Mayan-style mansion on Franklin Avenue would become the name everyone whispered and no one wrote down. But that is a story for later sections. For now, picture the rooms where these lives crossed. The Florentine gardens with its red velvet booths and showgirls in feathered headdresses. The dim hush of the Biltmore Hotel lobby, its ceiling painted gold, its carpets thick as moss. The all-night chilly parlors where waitresses poured coffee for cops at 3 in the morning. The bungalow courts off Cherokee Avenue, painted pink and pale green, where girls shared a single bathroom and a single phone. The canyon roads where headlights swept across oak branches and disappeared. This was the world Elizabeth Short moved through, a girl with black curls and gray-blue eyes, 22 years old, polite to waitresses and shy with strangers. She carried a small address book full of names. Some of those names belonged to soldiers she had written to during the war. Some belonged to men who had bought her dinner once. And some, the small handful that mattered most, belonged to people the Los Angeles Police Department would later refuse to question. The Hollywood that ate its young did not need monsters. It only needed silence, money, and a city willing to look the other way. By the first week of January 1947, all three were ready, and so was she. The last time anyone is sure they saw Elizabeth Short alive was the evening of January 9th, 1947. After that, for 6 full days, the trail goes soft and strange, like footprints fading into snow. Nobody can tell you for certain where she slept. Nobody can tell you what she ate, or who she spoke to, or which streets she walked. Those 6 days have swallowed more ink than almost any other gap in American crime, and still they refuse to give up their secrets. So let's sit with what came before. Let's settle into the small, ordinary rhythms of her life in those final weeks, when she was just a young woman moving through Los Angeles like a leaf moving down a slow river. In the weeks before she vanished, Elizabeth was living in a city soaked in winter sun. The Los Angeles of 1947 was warm in the afternoons and cool by night, the kind of place where the palm trees rattled in a soft wind and the sidewalks held the heat of the day long after dark. She drifted between cheap hotels, rooming houses, and the spare couches of girls she barely knew. Her suitcase was light. Her dresses were black, almost always black, with white collars or small bright trims that caught the eye. Her days had a gentle, drifting pattern. She would rise late, brush out her dark hair until it shone, and pin it back in soft waves. She wore powder on her pale skin and red lipstick the color of a ripe cherry. She liked to eat at small diners on Hollywood Boulevard, places with chrome counters and red vinyl stools, where the coffee came in thick white cups and the toast cost a dime. She would sit by the window and watch the cars roll past, the chrome bumpers flashing in the sun like little silver fish. In the afternoons, she walked. She walked the long blocks of downtown, past the marble columns of the old banks, past the movie palaces with their gold trim and their painted ceilings. She liked the lobby of the Biltmore Hotel best of all. It was a grand cathedral of a room, full of dark wood and crystal chandeliers and red carpet thick as moss. She would slip inside, take a seat near a potted palm, and pretend, just for an hour, that she belonged there. She wrote letters. She wrote to her mother back in Massachusetts, telling her things were fine, telling her California was beautiful. She wrote to old friends and to men she had met along the way. Soldiers mostly, some still overseas, some back home and married now to other girls. Her handwriting was small and neat, the letters slanting forward like they were leaning into a breeze. At night, she went to the clubs. Not the loud ones, not the wild ones. She liked the quieter places, the lounges with low lights and a piano in the corner, where a man in a dinner jacket played soft tunes, and the air smelled of cigarette smoke and gardenia perfume. She would nurse a single drink for hours. She rarely got drunk. People who knew her then said she seemed always to be waiting for something, watching the door, expecting someone who never quite came. She slept where she could, sometimes at the Chancellor, a rooming house on Cherokee Avenue where the girls all shared bathrooms and gossip in the hallway. Sometimes at the Hawthorne, sometimes on a friend's floor with a borrowed blanket pulled up to her chin. She kept her things in a trunk that traveled from address to address, full of folded dresses and movie magazines, and a few small photographs of family. She had small comforts. She loved the picture shows. She loved the warm darkness of the theater, the velvet seats, the great silver screen flickering above her like a window into a better world. She loved ice cream sundaes with hot fudge. She loved the salt smell of the ocean when she rode the bus out to the Santa Monica Pier. She loved sitting on a bench by the water as the gulls wheeled overhead, and the sun melted into the Pacific like a copper coin sinking through honey. That was her ordinary world, a drifting, dreamy life of borrowed beds and quiet afternoons, of red lipstick and black dresses, of slow walks and long letters home. A young woman with a soft voice and a faraway look, trying to find her place in a city that did not yet know her name. And then, on the evening of January 9th, she stepped out into the warm California dusk, and the world she knew closed gently behind her like a door. Up in the Hollywood Hills, on a street called Franklin Avenue, there stands a house that looks like it does not belong on this continent. The walls are made of poured concrete blocks, each one stamped with strange shapes, like letters from a language nobody speaks anymore. The roof is flat. The windows are narrow slits. From the street, it looks like a Mayan temple that wandered north and decided to sit down for a rest. This is the Sowden house. It was built in 1926 by an architect named Lloyd Wright, the son of a more famous father. Lloyd liked stone. He liked shadow. He liked rooms that swallowed sound. The Sowden house has a central courtyard open to the sky, and around that courtyard run dim hallways with low ceilings. Walking through, it feels like walking through a cave that someone has tried very hard to make beautiful. In 1945, a doctor bought the house. His name was George Hodel. He was 48 years old. He had black hair combed straight back and dark eyes that did not move much when he spoke. He was a surgeon by training, and he ran a clinic down on First Street that treated diseases people did not like to talk about. He was rich. He drove a black Packard. He wore tailored suits the color of wet stone. People who met Dr. Hodel said he had a strange way about him. He spoke softly. He listened too closely. He smiled with only the bottom half of his face. He could quote French poetry from memory, and he kept a piano in the front room. And at parties, he would play Debussy while the guests drank champagne and pretended they understood what they were hearing. The parties at the Sowden house were famous in a quiet way. They were not the kind of parties that made the newspapers. They were the kind of parties that the newspapers were not invited to. Movie producers came. Painters came. Police officials came. Politicians came, and they left their cars 2 blocks away so nobody would see them parking on Franklin. Inside, the rooms were lit by candles and red lamps. The walls cast long shadows that bent in the wrong places. There were carved masks from Mexico on the mantel, and African statues in the corners, and a long table in the dining room that could seat 20. Servants moved through the halls in soft shoes. The doors closed with a heavy, soundless weight, like the doors of a vault. Dr. Hodel had a basement in that house. Most homes in Los Angeles do not have basements. The ground is too dry, the foundations too shallow. But the Sowden house had one, and it was a strange one. The floor was concrete. The walls were concrete. There was a drain in the middle of the floor, the kind you see in slaughterhouses and operating rooms. The drain was bigger than it needed to be for a house. Down in his clinic on First Street, Dr. Hodel kept the tools of his trade locked in a glass cabinet. Scalpels, forceps, surgical scissors, and a bone saw. The bone saw was a thin steel blade with very small teeth, made for cutting through the hard parts of the human body without splintering them. A man who knew how to use a bone saw could separate a body at the joints with the patience of a butcher and the precision of a watchmaker. The doctor was a friend of important people. He played chess with the chief of police. He had photographs taken with the mayor. He had been to the home of Man Ray, the Surrealist photographer, and the two of them traded prints and ideas about beauty and death and the female form. Man Ray had a famous photograph called The Minotaur, in which a woman's body was posed with her arms above her head, cut off at the waist by shadow, her face turned away. In January of 1947, a young woman was found in a vacant lot in Lamert Park. Her body had been arms were posed above her head. Her face was turned away from the road. The cuts on her body had been made with the patience of a butcher and the precision of a watchmaker. The Sowden house sat 3 miles north of that lot. Inside the house, a doctor played Debussy on his piano. He poured wine for his guests. He smiled with only the bottom half of his face. And somewhere in the city, a detective opened a file and wrote down a name he was not allowed to say out loud. The name was George Hodel, and the house on Franklin Avenue would keep its secrets for another 50 years. Word travels strange in a city like Los Angeles. It moves through the back doors of diners and the loading docks of newspaper buildings. It slips between the bartenders at the Formosa Cafe and the script girls eating lunch at Schwab's. By the spring of 1947, the name George Hodel was already a soft murmur in certain rooms, though no badge ever rested on his shoulder. The people who knew him spoke carefully. They lowered their voices when they said his name, the way folks lower their voices in church. He was a man with money, and money in that town bought a kind of silence that thick fog couldn't match. Still, the murmurs traveled. They moved like smoke under a door. At the all-night coffee shops along Hollywood Boulevard, the reporters traded stories over chipped white mugs. They said the doctor had treated half the city for things no one talked about out loud. Bad infections, quiet pregnancies, sicknesses that came from sailors and back rooms and Saturday nights. A doctor who knew that many secrets, they said, was a doctor who could never be touched. Older men remembered the days before the war. They sat on the steps outside the bail bonds offices on First Street and chewed on the past like tobacco. One of them, a retired beat cop with a face like cracked leather, said he could name 3 women who had walked into Dr. Hodel's clinic on First Street and never quite walked out the same. One never walked out at all, he said, but the file went missing. The file always went missing. The barbers on Western Avenue had their own version. They said Hodel kept a key to every important door in the city. He had photographed the mayor's mistress. He had treated a studio chief's son for something shameful. He knew where the bodies were, the barbers said, because some of the bodies had passed across his own table. Down in Chinatown, where Hodel ran his venereal disease clinic, the old herbalists remembered him differently. They remembered a tall man in a fine gray suit who spoke their language and paid in crisp bills. He moved through their narrow streets like he owned the pavement under his shoes. The women who worked in the upstairs rooms knew his face. Some of them had stories. Most of them kept those stories tucked away like folded letters in a drawer. At the churches on Sunday, the talk took on a different shape. The old Mexican grandmothers in Boyle Heights crossed themselves when the Dahlia's name came up. They said the cutting of that poor girl was not the work of a man at all. It was something older, something that wore a man like a coat. They had a word for it in the old country, a word their own grandmothers had whispered. A creature that fed on shame and lived in houses built on bad ground. The Sowden house on Franklin Avenue, where the doctor lived, was already known as bad ground. The neighbors said the place had a feel to it. Children would not walk past it after dark. Dogs would not cross the driveway. A woman who delivered milk in those years swore she once heard a piano playing inside at 4 a.m, though every window stayed black as ink. Down at the LAPD's Central Division, the rookies heard things from the older detectives that they were told never to repeat. They heard that certain names came with certain warnings. They heard that some files lived in the bottom drawer and stayed there. A young patrolman named Vince once asked his sergeant why the Hodel name kept appearing and kept disappearing. The sergeant looked at him for a long moment and then went back to his coffee without a word. The Hollywood crowd had its own theories, traded over martinis at the Brown Derby. The writers said the doctor was a friend of Man Ray, the surrealist photographer. They said the two of them used to talk about art as a kind of violence, beauty as a kind of cutting. The writers said this with the slightly drunk certainty of men who had read too much and slept too little. And in the small bungalows where the working women of Hollywood lived, the ones who shared rent and shared clothes and shared cigarettes, the talk was simpler. They said, "Be careful." They said, if a man with a black bag and a slow smile asks you to dinner, find a reason to say no. They said the city was full of men who could open you up and put you back together, and a few who could open you up and leave you in the grass off Norton Avenue. The name traveled. The badge never came. The story of the Black Dahlia did not end when Elizabeth Short was buried. It went quiet for a long time. The case slipped into folders and filing cabinets, and the folders slipped into basements, and the basements filled with dust. For more than 50 years, the name George Hodel sat in those files like a stone at the bottom of a still pond. Nobody stirred the water. Nobody wanted to. Then in 1999, an old man died in San Francisco. His name was Steve Hodel. He had been a homicide detective for the Los Angeles Police Department for nearly 25 years. He had worked some of the worst killings the city ever saw, and he was the son of Dr. George Hodel, the surgeon in the big black house on Franklin Avenue. When Steve's father passed, a small album of photographs came into his hands. It was leather-bound and soft from age. Inside, tucked between pictures of family trips and Hollywood parties, were two small photographs of a woman with dark hair and dark eyes. Steve looked at them for a long time. He thought she looked familiar. He set the album down. He picked it up again. The woman in the photographs had the same shy smile, the same arched brow, the same soft slope of the shoulders as Elizabeth Short. To understand why a son would even look twice, you have to go back further than 1947. You have to go back before the bungalows and the boulevards. You have to go back to the land itself. The flat valley where Los Angeles now sprawls was once a quiet basin of oak and sage. The Tongva people lived there for thousands of years before the Spanish ships ever touched the coast. They called the place by many names, and they passed down stories about coyote and raven and the spirits that wandered between the hills. They knew the land could hide things. The dry washes filled with sudden rain. The fog rolled in from the sea like a slow gray tide and swallowed whole canyons. Bodies of deer and bear vanished into the brush and were never found again. When the Spanish came, they built a mission and called the small settlement El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora La Reina de los Angeles. The town grew slow at first. Adobe walls, dirt roads, a river that ran wide in winter and almost dry in summer. By the time the Americans took over in the 1840s, the place had already earned a strange reputation. Travelers wrote in their journals about how easy it was to disappear in Los Angeles. A man could ride into town with money in his pocket and never be heard from again. The hills swallowed people. The sea swallowed people. The desert to the east swallowed people. By the early 1900s, the city had grown into something restless and hungry. Oil derricks pumped on Signal Hill. Orange groves stretched to the horizon, and the movie cameras began to roll. Hollywood rose out of bean fields and lemon orchards almost overnight. With it came every kind of person looking to make something of themselves. Painters, dreamers, doctors, gangsters, showgirls. The city pulled them in like a great glittering net. It also pulled in men of certain appetites. Men with money and connections who learned quickly that Los Angeles was a place where the rules bent. The newspapers were owned by a few powerful families. The police chief answered to those same families. The district attorney played cards with them on Sunday nights. A scandal could be made to vanish. A witness could be made to forget. A body in a vacant lot was, more often than not, just a body in a vacant lot. This was the city George Hodel moved through. He had grown up in it, gone to school in it, taken his medical license in it. He knew every shadow. He knew which doors opened to which favors. He had treated movie stars and senators. He had photographed nudes in his parlor, with painters and writers laughing in the next room. Steve Hodel, sitting at his kitchen table with a leather album in front of him, knew all of this too. He had spent a career chasing killers through the same city. He knew how stories got buried. He knew how easy it was in this old strange place for the truth to slip into the dry wash and disappear. He poured himself a drink. He looked at the photographs again, and he began to wonder what his father had been. The land had kept its secrets for 1,000 years. Now a son was about to start digging. Steve Hodel could not sleep. He was a retired LAPD homicide detective, a man who had spent 30 years walking through other people's worst nights. He had closed more murders than most cops ever see. And now, in the quiet years after his father's death, he found himself sitting at a kitchen table in the small hours, holding 2 photographs in his hand and feeling the floor tilt under him. The photographs were old. They had been tucked inside his father's private album, the one no one was supposed to open. 2 black and white pictures of a dark-haired young woman. Her eyes were soft. Her mouth was closed. She looked like someone caught between a smile and a thought. Steve stared at her face for a long time. Then he set the photos down on the wood and rubbed his eyes until they burned. She looked like Elizabeth Short. That was the moment the search began. Not in a library, not in a police archive, but at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, with a son trying to convince himself his father was not the man he was starting to see. Steve told himself he would prove it false. He would dig until the resemblance dissolved. He would put the photos back in the album and forget them. Instead, he drove to the Sowden house. The Sowden house sits high on Franklin Avenue, in the curl of streets below the Hollywood Hills. It is a Mayan-style mansion built in 1926, designed by Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. From the sidewalk, it looks like an Aztec temple set down in California. All dark concrete blocks carved with sharp patterns. A heavy stone face that hides everything inside. The windows are narrow slits. The front door is set deep in shadow, framed by columns that loom like teeth in an open mouth. Pepper trees lean over the property. The afternoon light there has a strange green tint, filtered through leaves and old glass. This was the house where Dr. George Hill Hodel had lived in the years around the murder. Steve's father, the man with the photographs. Steve walked the block slowly. He stood across the street and looked up at the carved blocks, at the way the building seemed to hold its breath. He thought about what a child would not have noticed, but a detective would. He thought about basements, about sound, about the shape of the place, and how easy it would be, in a house like that, to keep a secret behind walls thick as a tomb. He began to dig in earnest. He pulled old case files. He read every public record on the Black Dahlia investigation. He read his father's medical school papers. George Hodel had been a surgeon. He had performed a procedure called a hemicorporctomy in his training, the same precise cut across the lower spine that had been used to sever Elizabeth Short's body in two. Steve read that line 3 times. Then he set the paper down and walked outside and stood in his yard until the cold came through his shirt. He found his father's name in the old 1949 files, not buried, not hidden, right there on lists the LAPD had compiled of suspects worth watching. He found the names of detectives who had followed George Hodel for weeks. He found notes about visits to the Sowden house. He found references to a stakeout, a wire, a tape recorder hidden somewhere inside those carved walls. And then he found the silence, the place where the file went quiet, where the trail of paper, so clear up to a point, simply stopped, as if someone had reached into the cabinet and closed a drawer that had been left open by mistake. Steve went back to the Sowden house many times. The current owners eventually let him in. He walked through the rooms his father had walked through. He stood in the courtyard at the center of the building, an open square of sky framed by those dark Mayan blocks. He went into the basement. He looked at the concrete floor. He looked at the drains. He looked at the places where the soil under the house had been disturbed years before and never explained. He left each time with more questions than he came with. Each visit added another small weight to a scale that was already tipping. By the end of his first year of searching, Steve Hodel had a folder of his own. It was thick. It held photographs and medical records and old police reports and the addresses of men long dead. And at the top of the folder, written in his own careful hand, was the name of his father. Three years had passed since the body in the field. The case had gone cold in the public eye, but quietly, behind closed doors, the district attorney's office was still listening, literally listening. In February of 1950, men from the DA's Bureau of Investigation crept into the basement of the Sowden house and planted tiny microphones in the walls. They ran the wires up through the pipes and out to a listening post nearby. Then they waited. The men who sat in that room, hunched over headphones for weeks on end, heard things they could not forget. Years later, some of them spoke. Their voices were soft, hesitant, like men still half afraid of what they had heard. One of them was an investigator named Walter Morgan. He was a young man then, fresh out of the war, proud to be working for the DA. He sat the night shift, headphones pressed tight against his ears, a notebook open on his knee. He said the house sounded alive, footsteps moving from room to room, doors opening and closing without anyone speaking, a piano playing slow, sad notes in the middle of the night, and then sometimes a woman crying, not loud, just soft, low sobs that seemed to drift up from somewhere deep in the house. Walter said he never forgot one night in particular. He heard a man's voice, calm and steady, say something about the Black Dahlia. He said the words came through clear as a bell. The man on the recording laughed, low and easy, and said the police would never solve it. He said it the way a man might talk about the weather. Another listener was a stenographer named Lillian Ruiz. Her job was to type up everything the microphones picked up. She sat in a small room with a typewriter and a stack of paper, and she listened for hours every day. She said the worst part was not the words. It was the silences. She said you could hear someone breathing in those silences, slow and patient, and you knew they were thinking. She said the house had a kind of weight to it, even over the wires, like the air inside was heavier than the air outside. Lillian remembered one recording where the doctor spoke to another man. The doctor said, quite plainly, that he had done it. He said the words like a man confessing a small sin. Then he laughed, the same low laugh Walter remembered, and said his daughter would never tell. Lillian typed the words exactly as she heard them. She handed the pages to her supervisor. She never saw them again. There was a third witness too, an older detective named Frank Jemison. Frank was the lead man on the listening operation. He was a quiet, careful man, the kind who weighed every word before he spoke. He said, years later, that he believed the doctor was the killer. He said the tapes left no doubt in his mind. He said he had heard the doctor speak of payoffs to police officers. He had heard him speak of bodies. He had heard him speak of women who had come and gone from the house and were never seen again. Frank kept his notes for the rest of his life. He kept them in a locked drawer in his home, and he told his family never to open it. When he died, an old man with a quiet smile, his daughter found the notes. She read them once and then put them away. She said she did not want to know more than she already knew. The microphones ran for 40 days. The reels stacked up, dozens of them, each one full of voices and footsteps and that slow piano. The men who listened went home each night and tried not to think about what they had heard. Walter said he used to stand on his porch and look at the stars and try to remember that the world was bigger than that house. Lillian said she stopped playing the piano. She could not bear the sound of it. When the operation ended, the tapes were boxed up and carried to a vault. The investigators wrote their reports. They said they believed they had their man. They handed the reports up the chain of command. And then, somewhere in the long, quiet hallways of City Hall, the case stopped moving. The tapes went into a drawer. The reports were filed away. The doctor walked free. The people who had listened went on with their lives. They married, raised children, grew old. But they never forgot the voice in the headphones, calm and easy, laughing about a girl in a field. Listen to the tapes long enough, and the strangeness starts to bloom. Not all at once. Slowly, the way mold spreads across an old wall. One sentence in February rhymes with one in March. A name dropped in passing on a Tuesday turns up again on a Friday. The voices on those reels were never meant to be a story. They were just a man living his private hours inside a microphone he didn't know was there. But stories form whether we want them to or not. The detectives who sat in the listening post above Hill Street began keeping a second notebook. The first was for facts. The second was for echoes, things that didn't quite add up but kept showing up. A particular hour of the night, a particular tone in the doctor's voice, the soft padding of footsteps in the courtyard when no guests had been announced, the way certain dates seemed to call certain people to the Sowden house like birds to a wire. January 9th, 10, 11, 12, 13. Those 5 days kept circling back. Elizabeth Short had last been seen on January 9th, 1947. She was found in the field on the morning of January 15th. The week between those dates was the whole case fell into. And on the tapes, 3 years later, the doctor seemed to mark those same days with a strange, quiet attention. He played certain records. He spoke in a lower voice. He told a woman on January 12th of 1950 that the date had weight. He did not explain what he meant. The detectives wrote it down twice and underlined it once. Names began to repeat too. A nurse who had worked at one of the doctor's clinics in the mid-40s came up in 3 separate conversations. She had left town suddenly in February of 1947. Nobody knew where she went. A handyman who did odd jobs at the Sowden house had quit 3 weeks after the killing. He had moved to Bakersfield and refused to come back, even for his last paycheck. A young woman the doctor called only by a first name had been a regular guest in 1946. By the spring of 1947, she was gone from every record the detectives could find. People kept disappearing from the edges of his life, the way smoke pulls away from a flame. The pattern went deeper than people. It went into rooms. The basement came up again and again, mentioned in passing, never in detail. A trip to the hardware store for cleaning supplies in late January 1947 turned up in a tax receipt the investigators pulled. Bleach, lye, heavy canvas, things a doctor might buy for 100 ordinary reasons, things that, laid next to everything else, looked like something colder. Then came the tape that should have ended it all. It was recorded on the night of February 18th, 1950. The detectives in the listening post heard a woman screaming far away, somewhere deep in the house. They heard the doctor's voice, calm, and even telling someone else in the room not to worry. They heard a man answer him. They heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across a tile floor. They heard water running for a long time. And then they heard the doctor say, in a tone as flat as a closed door, that this was how it had been done before. The reels turned. The needles dipped. The wire spools wound up the words like thread on a spindle. 2 detectives sat in a small rented room and stared at each other across a wooden table while the lamp above them buzzed a thin yellow hum. they had it. After 3 years of dead ends and dead leads and dead witnesses, they had the doctor on his own tape, in his own house, speaking the words that should have put him in a chair under hot lights downtown. They wrote up the report that night. They typed it slowly on a heavy black underwood, double-spaced, 3 carbon copies. They put the original in a sealed envelope. They walked it themselves to the office of the chief of detectives the next morning, before the sun was fully up over the hills. And then nothing happened. No arrest warrant. No raid. No knock at the iron gate on Franklin Avenue. The tape sat in a safe. The report sat in a drawer. The doctor went on with his evenings and his dinner parties and his slow, careful walks through the courtyard fountain. And the city outside his walls went on pretending the case had grown cold by itself. The pattern was on the tape. The shape was clear. Somebody high up in the building had decided that the shape would never be seen. His name was Lieutenant Frank Jemison. He worked for the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, not the police, and that small fact matters more than you might think. In 1949, almost 3 years after Elizabeth Short was found in that empty lot, the district attorney came to believe the LAPD had bungled the case. Maybe worse than bungled. So he opened a quiet investigation of his own, and he put Frank Jemison in charge. Jemison was a careful man, slow speaker, heavy-lidded eyes, the kind of investigator who wrote down every name, every phone number, every rumor that drifted past his desk. He kept a brown leather notebook and filled it with neat block letters. He listened more than he talked. And by the time he was done, that notebook had grown into a file so thick a grown man could barely lift it. The file lived in a steel cabinet in the basement of the Hall of Justice in downtown Los Angeles. The building was a great gray box of granite and limestone, 16 stories tall, with arched windows that looked out over Temple Street. Inside, the hall smelled of floor wax and old paper. The basement was colder than the rest, lit by yellow bulbs that buzzed like trapped flies. Down there, in row after row of locked drawers, the secrets of the city slept like coiled snakes. Jemison's file held something like 100 suspects. He worked them one by one. He sent investigators to bus stations and dance halls. He pulled bank records. He tracked down old boyfriends and roommates and waitresses who had served Elizabeth coffee at the diner counter. Most of the names led nowhere. A drifter who had bragged in a bar, a medical student with a strange smile, a bellhop who had once delivered ice to her hotel room. Jemison crossed them off, slowly, patiently, like a man weeding a long garden. But one name kept rising back up out of the soil. Dr. George Hodel. By the autumn of 1949, Jemison had become convinced that Hodel deserved more than a passing look. The reasons sat in neat folders inside the larger file. There were the medical skills, of course. The bisection of Elizabeth's body had been done with surgical precision, and Hodel was a trained surgeon. There were the witnesses who placed Elizabeth near his clinic on Melrose Avenue in the last days of her life. There were the rumors of strange parties at the Sowden house on Franklin Avenue, with its Mayan stone walls and its hidden inner courtyard. There were the whispers from people who had worked for Hodel and would not say his name above a whisper. So Jemison did something that, in 1950, was almost unheard of. He went to a judge and got permission to plant microphones inside Hodel's home. 2 of them, small brass listening devices hidden in the walls, wired down to a receiver in the basement, where 2 officers sat in shifts with headphones over their ears and reels of tape spinning slowly through the long February nights. For 40 days and 40 nights, they listened. They wrote down what they heard in shorthand notebooks. They marked the time of every footstep, every cough, every door slam. And what they captured, according to the transcripts that survived, was enough to chill any honest investigator to the bone. Jemison added the transcripts to his file. He added them carefully, page by typed page, each sheet stamped with the date and the case number. He cross-referenced them with witness statements and timeline charts and photographs of the body. He drew arrows in red pencil between names. He built, in that brown leather notebook and those swelling folders, the most complete picture of the Black Dahlia case that anyone has ever assembled. And then, somewhere between 1950 and 1951, the file went quiet. Hodel left the country. He flew to Hawaii first, then on to Asia, and he did not come back to Los Angeles for nearly 40 years. The district attorney's office moved on to other cases. Jemison kept his notebook, but he stopped talking about the Dahlia. When reporters asked, he would only say that the case had been a difficult one and that mistakes had been made. He never named the mistakes. He never named the names. The file itself went into that steel cabinet in the basement. It sat there in the cool dark, page by page, witness by witness. It sat there while the city above changed and grew. It sat there while the people who had lived the case grew old and died, one by one. And it sat there, locked, waiting for someone to come back down the stairs and ask the question nobody else had thought to ask. Every great mystery has one detail that does not fit, one small thing that sits in the corner of the story like a stone in a shoe. You can move around it. You can pretend it isn't there, but it never goes away. In the Black Dahlia case, that detail is a folder that sat inside the Los Angeles Police Department for decades. A folder that, according to the people who worked near it, carried a strange instruction on the outside. Do not open, do not file, do not share. Some who saw it said the words were written in pencil. Others said they were stamped in dark ink. The exact look of the thing depends on who is telling the tale, but the meaning never changes. This folder was not for the public. This folder was not even for most of the police. Inside, the story goes, were the pieces of the case that pointed away from the official line. Names that never made the newspapers. Statements from witnesses who came forward and then quietly walked back into their lives. Photographs that nobody outside the building ever saw, and tucked in among the pages, the name of the doctor, the surgeon with the big stone, house up on Franklin Avenue, the man whose son would one day kick open this very can of worms. The folder, if you believe the people who spoke about it, sat in a locked cabinet on an upper floor. Not in the regular evidence room. Not in the case archive where any working detective could pull it. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere with fewer keys. The cabinet itself was plain gray metal, the kind you see in any old government office, scuffed at the corners, the paint worn down to bare steel by years of hands brushing past. But the lock was newer than the cabinet. That was the part people remembered. Imagine the room where it lived. A long hallway with green tile floors waxed to a dull shine. Frosted glass doors with black lettering. The smell of old coffee and cigarette smoke baked into the walls. Yellow lamplight pooling on a desk where a clerk worked through stacks of paper that would never be opened by the public. Somewhere down that hallway, behind a door that needed 2 keys, sat the cabinet. And inside the cabinet sat the folder. And on the folder sat those 3 small words: "Do not open." Now, the LAPD has, over the years, said many things about this folder. Some officials have said it never existed at all. Others have said it existed, but contained nothing unusual. A few, speaking quietly years after their retirements, have said it existed and contained exactly what people feared it contained. The truth depends entirely on which old officer you happen to be sitting across from, and how much coffee you have shared, and how late the hour has grown. What is harder to argue with is this: detectives who tried to look into the doctor in later years often found that the paperwork they needed was missing. Reports filed in the late 40s had gaps in them, pages numbered 7 and 8, with no page 9. Statements that referenced earlier statements that no longer existed. Names mentioned in one document and crossed out in another. A long paper trail with patches of road washed away. When the doctor's own son, decades later, asked to see the case files, he was given some pages and refused others. He was told certain materials had been lost. He was told certain materials had been damaged. He was told certain materials had simply never existed, even when other documents in his hand mentioned them by name. The folder, real or rumor, became its own kind of ghost, a shape in the dark that nobody could quite photograph, but everybody could feel. Reporters wrote about it. Authors hunted for it. Retired cops dropped hints about it over dinner, and then changed the subject when the plates were cleared. It hovered above the case like a low cloud that would not move on. And here is the thing to sit with. whether the folder existed exactly as people described it or not. Something inside that police department kept the doctor's name from ever reaching a courtroom. Something kept the file thin where it should have been thick. Something kept the questions quiet that should have been shouted. Maybe it was a folder. Maybe it was a phone call. Maybe it was a handshake in a back office between men who understood each other without needing to speak. Whatever it was, it worked. For 70-some years, it has worked. And the words on that folder, real or imagined, have held. Do not open. Not everyone bought the doctor theory. They didn't buy it in 1949, and they don't buy it now. And the skeptics, the ones who shake their heads at the Sowden house and the basement and the tapes, they have reasons, good reasons, the kind that deserve a fair hearing before you decide what you believe. Their first argument goes like this. Los Angeles in the late 40s was a graveyard for young women. Elizabeth Short was not the only one. She was not even the only one that year. The papers called it the lipstick killer summer, the season of the lonely hearts, the time when girls came west chasing pictures and vanished like steam off a sidewalk. There was Jean French. They found her 2 weeks after Elizabeth, beaten to death on a stretch of road in West Los Angeles. Someone had written words across her bare stomach in dark red lipstick. She had come to California to be a nurse, then an actress, then a wife. She ended up in a vacant lot beside a tire track and a cold wind. There was Georgette Bauerdorf, a young heiress, found drowned in her own bathtub in a Hollywood apartment in 1944. The door was locked from the inside. A rag had been pushed down her throat. She had been dancing the night before at the Hollywood canteen, smiling at soldiers, sipping ginger ale. Then she went home and never woke up. There was Gertrude Evelyn Landon. There was Laura Trelstad. There was Dorothy Montgomery. Names you have never heard, faces that flickered for one news cycle and then drifted into the gray fog of forgotten files. 6 women by some counts, 8 by others, all young, all beautiful in the soft, hopeful way of girls who had just stepped off a train. So the skeptics ask a simple question. If one doctor in one big stone house killed Elizabeth Short, who killed the others. And if one man killed them all, why do the wounds not match? Some were strangled, some were beaten, some were cut, but not like Elizabeth. None were drained of blood. None were posed in a field like a broken doll. None carried that strange surgical signature. The skeptics say Lowe's Angels was simply a hunting ground, a boomtown drunk on its own light, with too many drifters and too many shadows, and not enough cops who cared. A young woman alone in 1947 was a candle in a windstorm. You did not need a mastermind surgeon to explain her death. You needed only the city itself. And there is more. The skeptics point to the doctor's age in 1947. They point to his bad back, his social calendar, his alibi that placed him at a dinner party the night Elizabeth was last seen alive. They point to the fact that his own son, the man who built the case against him, was a child when it happened. A child carries different memories than a witness. A child fills the gaps with the shape of his own pain. These are not foolish arguments. They are careful ones. They deserve to sit at the table. But here is where even the skeptics grow quiet. Here is the thing they cannot quite explain away. Of all the women who died in Lowe's Angels in those years, only Elizabeth Short was cut in half at the waist. Only Elizabeth was drained. Only Elizabeth was posed, arms above her head, mouth widened into that long, terrible smile. The wound that split her body was clean, deliberate, made by someone who knew exactly where the spine gave way to soft tissue, the kind of cut a butcher could not make, the kind of cut a hobbyist could not make, the kind of cut that required training in a room with bright lights and a steel table. And then there are the letters. The notes mailed to the newspapers after her death, pasted together from magazine print, taunting the police, naming nobody and everybody. Those letters arrived only after Elizabeth. The other women got no letters. The other women got no nicknames. The other women did not become legends. Something about her case stood apart. Something about it was personal, theatrical, almost designed for the camera flash. The skeptics can give you a city full of killers. They can give you 100 quiet murders in 100 quiet lots. What they cannot give you is another woman cut in half on a field in Lamert Park. While the morning light came up pink over the palms, that detail belongs to Elizabeth alone. And whoever did that to her was not a stranger in the dark. He was an artist. He was a craftsman. He was someone who wanted to be remembered. To understand how a man could stand so close to the center of a murder and never feel the weight of a single handcuff, you have to understand the city he lived in. Los Angeles in the late 1940s wore two faces. One was bright and sunlit, full of orange groves and white stucco houses with red tile roofs. The other lived behind heavy oak doors, in dim rooms lit by green bankers' lamps, where men in dark suits passed envelopes across polished desks. Dr. George Hodel walked freely between both worlds. His house on Franklin Avenue sat on a hill like a stone ship. The Sowden place looked like a Mayan temple dropped into Hollywood, with sharp angles and a long central courtyard open to the sky. Inside, the rooms smelled of cigar smoke and orchids. Servants moved like shadows along the tiled floors. Guests came in through the iron gate at all hours, and the parties spilled out under strings of paper lanterns that swayed in the warm, dry wind. The guests were not ordinary people. Police captains came to drink. Judges sat in the leather chairs. Politicians ate from the long carved table. The director, John Huston, had been married to Hodel's second wife before Hodel met her, and Huston still came around. The photographer Man Ray, the surrealist genius from Paris, was a close friend. He took portraits of Hodel and his children. He drank in the courtyard and laughed under the desert stars. These were not just friends. They were a wall, a soft, smiling, well-tailored wall that stood between Hodel and the rest of the world. There were people who knew, people who saw things and never forgot. A maid who heard a woman screaming in the basement and was told to go home early. A driver who picked up strange packages and learned to ask no questions. A young secretary in the district attorney's office who typed reports and watched them disappear into locked drawers. They saw the shape of the thing, even if they could not see the whole. Some of them carried what they knew for the rest of their lives. They told their children. They told their priests. They told no one at all and let The secrets sit inside them like a stone in a coat pocket. The ones who tried to speak found that speaking cost them. A young officer who pushed too hard on the Hodel name found himself reassigned to a desk in the valley. A reporter who started asking questions about the parties on Franklin Avenue found his sources going quiet, his calls unreturned, his editor suddenly cool. The ones who stayed silent were rewarded with calm. The ones who spoke were rewarded with nothing. Steve Hodel, the doctor's own son, came to believe his father was the killer. He was a homicide detective himself, with a long career and a steady reputation. He spent decades after his father's death gathering the pieces. And when he finally laid them out in his book, he did it with the calm voice of a man who had stopped caring whether anyone believed him. He had lived too long with the truth to argue about it. He simply set it down on the table like a deck of old cards and walked away. Other believers came forward too. A retired lapped officer named Mike Frasiani said he had seen the surveillance files in the 1950s and knew Hodel was the prime suspect. A district attorney's investigator named Walter Morgan kept his own private notebook on the case until the day he died. Their certainty was quiet. It did not shout. It did not demand. It simply existed like a rock in a creek that the water has to flow around. What did they gain by speaking up? A clear conscience, maybe. The strange peace that comes from finally saying the thing you have carried for years. What did they lose? Promotions, friends, the easy welcome of the city's powerful rooms. The friends in high places protected George Hodel while he lived. They protected his name long after he was gone. But the believers, the ones who saw what they saw and would not unsee it, kept chipping at the silence. A grain at a time, a name at a time, a document pulled out of a basement box at a time. The wall of friends was tall and smooth and seemed to reach to the sky. But walls weather, walls crack, and the people who stand at the base of them, patient and certain, sometimes outlive the men who built them. In the end, the believers had something the friends in high places did not. They had time, and they were willing to wait. Lowe's Angels forgets quickly. The city paves over its bones and builds again. certain corners of the old town still seem to remember what happened in the winter of 1947. The land itself keeps a kind of ledger, and if you know where to walk, you can almost feel the pages turning under your feet. Start with the field on Norton Avenue. The vacant lot where the body was found is gone now, swallowed by stucco houses and trimmed hedges. Lawns grow there, green and ordinary. But people who live on that block tell quiet stories. They say the grass on one patch comes in thinner than the rest. They say a particular row of hedges never quite takes root, no matter how often the gardeners replant. The soil there is the same soil as everywhere else in Lamert Park. Nothing about the chemistry should be different, yet something in the ground seems to refuse what is planted on it. Old neighbors used to point to a single jacaranda tree that grew on the corner. It bloomed purple every spring like the others up and down the street, but its trunk leaned at a strange angle, away from the empty lot, as if the tree had spent decades trying to walk somewhere else. When the city cut it down in the 70s, the workers found the roots had grown in a tight knot, refusing to spread. A small thing, a nothing thing, but the kind of nothing that stays in the mind. Now drive north and east, up into the hills above Franklin Avenue to the Sowden house. The Mayan walls still stand. The carved stone faces still stare down from the eaves like sleepy gods. But the gardens around it have always given trouble. Owners over the years have planted citrus, jacaranda, bird of paradise. Some thrive, some shrivel within a season. A koi pond installed in the courtyard cracked twice in the same year, both times along the same hairline. The ground beneath the house shifts in ways the geologists cannot quite explain. Hollywood sits on small fault lines, sure. But this house seems to ride one of its own. Workers who remodeled the basement in the early 2000s told stories afterward. They said the concrete in one corner refused to cure properly. They poured it, smoothed it, walked away. They came back to find it cracked along a single line, as clean as if drawn with a ruler. They patched it. It cracked again. After the third try, they simply tiled over it and said nothing in the report. Animals notice things people miss. Neighbors of the Sowden house have mentioned over the years that the coyotes who roam those hills cut a wide path around the property. They cross every other yard in the canyon, drinking from pools, snatching small dogs, leaving prints on the soft soil. But the Sowden lot they skip. Cats sit on the wall and stare into the courtyard and will not jump down. Crows do not nest in the trees that hang over its roof. A naturalist would call this nonsense. Yet the people who live with these animals every day swear it is true. There is also the matter of the canyon roads. The hills behind the house drain into a network of small culverts and creeks that flow only when it rains hard. One of those creeks shifted course sometime in the late 40s, according to old maps. The water used to run east toward the Los Angeles River. After a heavy winter, it began running south. The change is small. A city engineer would tell you these things happen. But the timing has not escaped the people who pay attention. The river that ran past the doctor's house chose a different way home. Out in Norton's empty lot, before the houses came, locals used to walk their dogs along the weed-choked edges. They said the dogs would not cross into the middle of the field. They would pull on their leashes, plant their paws, whine softly. A small girl once told her mother that the grass there felt cold even on a hot day. The mother laughed. Then she stepped into the field herself and felt it too. These are not proofs. No court would hear them. No detective would write them down. They are the kind of evidence the land keeps in its own slow language. Trees that lean the wrong way. Soil that will not hold. Animals that take the long route home. A creek that changes its mind. Los Angeles paves over its secrets, but the ground beneath the asphalt remembers. And sometimes, if you walk those streets at the right hour, you can feel the city remembering with you. There is a painting that hangs in the memory of the case like a shadow on a white wall. It was made by a man named Man Ray. He was an American who lived for a long time in Paris, and he made art that felt like dreams, half remembered. In 1934, he finished a piece called The Lovers. It shows a pair of red lips floating across a pale sky. The lips are huge. They drift above a green field like something cut loose from a face. The mouth is open just slightly, as if about to speak, or perhaps about to smile. Years later, when the body of Elizabeth Short was found in that empty Lowe's Angels lot, the people who knew Man Ray's work felt a cold thing move through them. Her mouth had been cut. The wound went from the corners of her lips out toward her ears, opening her face into a wide, frozen grin. Painters call that shape a Glasgow smile. Surrealists called it something else. They called it a study of the mouth. And Man Ray, the painter of floating red lips, had been living in Lowe's Angels during the war years. He had moved there in 1940. He stayed until 1951. He lived only a few miles from the house on Franklin Avenue, where the suspect doctor held his strange parties. The two men knew each other. That is not a guess. That is a fact written in letters and guest books and old photographs. They drank together. They shared dinners under low yellow lamps. They moved through the same small world of artists and doctors and writers who gathered in the hills above Hollywood when the rest of the city was asleep. In that world, the line between picture and flesh sometimes felt thin. Surrealism wanted to break the rules of the waking mind. It wanted to put dreams onto canvas. And in dreams, bodies do strange things. They float, they split, they open. Researchers who studied the case for decades noticed something else. The way the body had been left in that field was careful. It was arranged. The hands were placed above the head. The legs were spread in a clean, deliberate shape. The two halves of her had been set apart with a kind of awful symmetry. To a normal eye, it was horror. To an eye trained in surrealist art, it looked almost composed. It looked like a picture. Some say it looked like another Man Ray work called The Minotaur, in which a woman's torso is photographed in shadow, her arms thrown above her head in the same exact pose. This is the parallel. This is the strange echo that runs through the case like a second heartbeat. Across America, there are stories where art and crime brush against each other. In New York, in the 1890s, a writer named Ambrose Bierce wrote tales of bodies found in poses too perfect to be accidents. In New Orleans in the 1920s, a jazz musician was killed and laid out in a way that mirrored a famous painting hanging in a French quarter gallery. In Chicago, decades later, detectives spoke quietly of a case where a young woman was found posed like a figure from a Renaissance fresco. None of these were ever solved. None of them ever made the front pages for long. They sit in the back rooms of old police buildings, in folders that smell of dust and forgotten coffee. What ties them together is the feeling that the killer was speaking a language only certain people could read, a language of pictures, a language of references. The body becomes a sentence. The field becomes a frame. And the artist, whoever he was, walks away into the crowd, knowing that most eyes will never see what he left behind. In the case of Elizabeth Short, the language seemed to point at one small circle of men: painters, surgeons, photographers, people who understood the body as a thing that could be taken apart and put back together. Man Ray himself was never accused of anything. He was a famous artist who moved in famous rooms, but his paintings hung on the walls of the doctor's house. His ideas floated in the air of those late dinners. And after 1947, after the body in the lot, his work seemed to carry a new weight, as if the canvas had absorbed something it should not have. The painting of the floating lips still exists. It hangs in a museum now. People walk past it every day. They see only red lips on a pale sky. They do not see the field. They do not see the smile. Nine days after they found her in the field, a package arrived at the Lowe's Angels Examiner. The morning was warm for January. The sky over downtown the color of old milk. A male clerk lifted the envelope from the pile and felt the weight of it shift in his hands, soft and heavy at once, like a sack of damp sand. The address on the front had been pieced together from letters cut from magazines and newspapers. Each tiny scrap of print was glued in place with care, the way a child might assemble a valentine. Inside that envelope was Elizabeth Short's life, scrubbed clean and offered up like a gift. There was her birth certificate, neatly folded. There were photographs of her, smiling in a checkered coat, leaning against a railing on some beach. There was her social security card. There was an address book bound in dark leather, its gold lettering reading Mark Hansen across the cover. Whoever had killed her did not simply want to hide what they had done. They wanted the city to look. They wanted the newsroom to feel the weight of her in their hands. The package smelled faintly of gasoline. Police later said the killer had soaked everything in fuel to wipe away fingerprints. Even so, a single partial print survived on one corner of an envelope. It was sent to the FBI in Washington. The smudge was too poor to match. The lead, like so many others, dissolved into the warm Lowe's Angel's air. Other letters followed. They arrived at the Examiner, at the Herald Express, at the LAPD itself. Some were written in pencil on cheap notebook paper. Others used the same magazine cutout style, words snipped from glossy ads and pasted into ransom note shapes. One read in jagged paper letters, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Another promised the killer would turn himself in on a certain street corner at a certain hour. Nobody came. The corner stayed empty under the street lamp, the pavement shining from a thin winter rain. You can still see scans of those letters today. The paper has yellowed to the color of weak tea. The glue has darkened around each pasted word. Some of the cutouts came from the same issues of the same magazines, suggesting a single pair of scissors, a single quiet room, a single person hunched over a table with a small jar of paste at their elbow. Someone took their time. Someone enjoyed the work. The address book in the package became its own small mystery. Pages had been torn out. Whole sections were missing. The empty stubs ragged along the spine. Whoever sent the parcel had decided which names the city could see and which names the city could not. Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner whose name was stamped on the cover, told police the book had been stolen from his home. He swore he barely knew the girl. The pages that survived held the numbers of waiters, dancers, soldiers on leave, a few small-time agents. The pages that vanished have never been recovered. There were other artifacts too, smaller things, the kind that gather around a story like dust around a lamp, a handbag, and one black suede shoe turned up in a trash can 2 miles from where her body was found. A bus driver remembered her sitting near the window the night before, watching the city slide by, her dark hair tucked under a small white hat. A waitress at a drugstore counter said she had ordered a Coke and stared a long time at the door, as if waiting for someone who never walked through it. And there is the photograph, the one taken of her by a friend a few months before her death, the one that has been printed in every book and magazine since. She sits on a low wall with her hands folded in her lap. The light falls soft across her face. Behind her, just at the edge of the frame, a man's shadow stretches across the pavement. No one has ever identified him. He might have been a passerby, a stranger pausing to light a cigarette. He might have been nothing at all, but the shadow is there, long and thin, leaning toward her like something patient. These are the things you can hold. The letters, the address book, the shoe, the photograph with its quiet shadow. They sit in evidence rooms and archive boxes, soft with age, smelling faintly of old paper and faded glue. They do not solve the case. They only remind you that somewhere, in a small, quiet room with a jar of paste, a person took his time. And that person, whoever he was, wanted to be remembered. Every old newsroom has its ghosts. The ones who sat at certain desks, smoked certain brands, chased certain stories, until the stories chased them back. In Lowe's Angels, in the long years after the Dahlia case went cold, one name kept drifting up through the cigarette smoke like a coin in a fountain. Bevo Means, a reporter for the Herald Express. The man who, by most accounts, first called Elizabeth Short by the name the whole world would come to know. The story, as it gets passed around old kitchen tables, goes something like this. Bevo was working a slow week in the Long Bar at a drugstore down in Long Beach. The kind of place with green leather booths and a clock that always ran 2 minutes fast. He was asking the soda jerks what they remembered. He was asking the regulars, and one of them, an older fellow with grease on his cuffs, said the girl in the papers used to come in here. They called her the Black Dahlia, he said, on account of her dark hair and the way she dressed all in black, like the picture playing across town. The Blue Dahlia, a movie with Alan Ladd and a killer nobody could quite name. Bevo wrote it down. He filed the story, and the nickname stuck to Elizabeth Short the way frost sticks to a window pane in January, clean and permanent and impossible to scrape off. much the family remembers. That much the newspaper archives confirm. But the rest of what gets whispered at those holiday tables is harder to pin down, because Bevo means kept working the case long after the front pages moved on. He kept a notebook. He kept names. And somewhere in that little leather book, according to the people who knew him, was a name he never typed up for print. His daughter would tell the story years later, the way you tell a thing you have heard since childhood. How her father came home one night with his hat still on and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without saying a word. How her mother poured him coffee and waited. How he finally looked up and said, "I know who did it." And then he said, "But I can't write it. Not yet. Maybe not ever." The walls of the house were yellow. The radio was playing low. Outside, the palm trees moved in the warm wind like slow dancers. That is how she remembered it. The exact yellow of the wall. The exact bend of her father's shoulders. Some details a child keeps forever, smooth as river stones in a pocket. Bevo never did write the name. He hinted at it in conversations with other reporters, the way newspapermen hint at things, with a tilt of the head and a long pull on a cigarette. He told one colleague the killer was a doctor. He told another the killer had friends downtown. He told a third that the file at the district attorney's office held more than the LAPD would ever admit. And then, like so many in this story, he let the matter drop. Not because he stopped believing, because believing was no longer enough. The family kept the notebook for a while. That part of the story gets fuzzy. Some say it was lost in a move. Some say it was given to a younger reporter who passed it along to someone else. Some say it sat in a cardboard box in a garage in the San Fernando Valley until the box was thrown out by mistake during an estate sale in the 1970s. A small brown book with a frayed spine. Names inside in pencil. Gone now, like so much else. But the daughters and the sons of the men who chased this case all tell some version of the same thing. Their fathers knew more than they said. Their fathers came home tired in a way that had nothing to do with deadlines. Their fathers drank a little extra around the anniversary every January and stared out the window at the lemon trees and would not be drawn into conversation about the girl in the field. A story told that many times by that many people in that many kitchens develops its own gravity. The details shift. The yellow wall becomes blue in one telling, green in another. The notebook is leather, then cloth, then leather again. But the shape of the thing holds. A reporter who knew. A name he would not print. A silence that traveled down through families like a piece of inherited furniture, heavy and dark, and always in the corner of the room. In Lowe's Angels, the past does not sleep. It only rolls over and waits. Step away from the loud arguments for a moment. Step away from the doctor and his son, from the painters and the politicians, from the basement and the bone saw. Underneath all of it, there is a quieter layer to this story. A softer layer made of ordinary people who saw small things and tried to remember them right. The case had dozens of witnesses, not the famous ones, not the ones whose names made the morning papers, the waitresses who poured Elizabeth coffee, the bellhops who carried her thin little suitcase up narrow hotel stairs, the streetcar conductors who watched her step on with her dark hair pinned high, the drugstore clerks who sold her lipstick and a postcard home. These were the people who actually knew her last weeks, in the way strangers know a stranger, through small kindnesses and quick glances. And almost every one of them, over the years, changed their story, not in big ways, not in ways that pointed fingers at new killers, in small ways. A woman who first said she saw Elizabeth on a Tuesday later remembered it was a Wednesday. A man who swore he saw her with a tall fellow in a dark suit later said the fellow was shorter, and maybe the suit was gray. A waitress at a diner on South Olive Street told one reporter she served Elizabeth a slice of cherry pie. Years later, she told another reporter it was coffee and toast. Years after that, she said maybe it wasn't Elizabeth at all. Memory is a strange country. It shifts the way sand shifts under a slow tide. The longer you walk on it, the more your footprints fade. Some changed their stories because they were scared. After the first headlines, after the first photographers camped on lawns, ordinary folks learned that being a witness in Lowe's Angels came with a price. Phones rang at odd hours. cars idled across the street. Polite men in pressed coats knocked on screen doors and asked them, very gently, if they were quite sure about what they had said. Most of them stopped being sure. That was the safer thing to be. Some changed their stories because they wanted to matter. A man who saw Elizabeth once in passing might, after a year of barroom tellings, remember her sitting in his booth. A woman who had only heard about the case from a neighbor might, after enough whiskey and enough listening ears, recall a dark sedan parked outside her window the night before the field. Stories grow when you feed them. People grow with the stories they tell. And some changed their stories because they could not bear what they had seen. The boy who delivered groceries to a certain house on a certain hill. The cleaning woman who walked into a certain back room and walked right out again without finishing her work. They told their families pieces of things. Then they told their families nothing. They carried the pieces alone, the way you might carry a stone in your pocket without ever taking it out. This is the quiet truth of the Black Dahlia case. Something happened in Los Angeles in the winter of 1947 that touched far more people than the official files suggest. It rippled through diners and apartment buildings and church basements. It changed the way neighborhoods looked at each other. It changed which doors stayed locked and which alleys stayed empty after dark. The city itself learned to be careful, and that carefulness did not leave when the headlines did. You can still feel it, people say, in certain parts of Los Angeles. The old neighborhoods near Norton Avenue, the blocks around the Biltmore Hotel where she was last seen for certain, the hills above Franklin where the Sowden house still stands behind its iron gate. Locals will tell you the air feels different there. Heavier, slower. Like the place itself remembers a thing the people in it have agreed to forget. Maybe that is what unsolved mysteries really are. Not just puzzles with missing pieces. They are wounds in a community's memory. Places where the story will not knit closed because too many threads were pulled at once, and nobody was allowed to tie them off. The witnesses who changed their stories were not liars. Most of them were not even cowards. They were ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives in the shadow of something too big to look at straight. They told what they could. forgot what they had to. They passed the rest down in pieces, to children, to grandchildren, to strangers in late-night kitchens who happened to ask the right question at the right time. And the pieces, all together, still make a shape. Just not one anyone can quite name. Step outside with me for a moment. Leave the lights of the freeway behind. Walk with me down a quiet street in Los Angeles, past the bottle-brush trees and the sleeping bungalows, until we reach a low building on a corner. The windows are dark. The parking lot is empty. The air smells of warm asphalt and night-blooming jasmine, and somewhere far off a dog barks once and goes still. This is where the records used to live. Not the building you see now, but the one that stood in its place long ago. The old police archive, where every case in the city slept inside paper folders, stacked in steel cabinets that smelled of dust and pencil shavings. The Black Dahlia file was in there. So were the notes from the wiretaps. So were the names that nobody was supposed to say out loud. Stand here on the sidewalk a minute. Listen, you can hear the city breathing. A bus sighs to a stop 2 blocks away. A palm frond rattles in a soft wind. The hills above Hollywood sit like sleeping animals, dark humps against a softer dark sky. The stars are dim here, washed thin by the streetlights, but a few still burn through. Orion in winter. The bright, slow blink of a plane drifting toward Burbank. They say a fire came through these halls one night. Not a wildfire, not a roaring blaze. A small, careful fire. The kind that only burns what someone wants burned. By morning, certain pages were ash in a metal can. Certain photographs had curled into black petals. Certain names had stopped existing on paper, as if a hand had reached back into time and wiped them clean. Nobody could say exactly how it started. A faulty wire, the report said. An old socket, the kind of thing that happens in old buildings. The men who came to look at the damage shook their heads and wrote it down and went home. And the families who waited on answers waited a little longer, and then forever. Picture the room as it must have been that night. The long fluorescent lights humming overhead. The rows of cabinets, drawer after drawer, each one packed tight with manila folders. The smell of old coffee in a pot left on too long. A single janitor maybe, pushing a broom down the hall, headphones in his ears, hearing nothing. Outside, the same warm wind we feel now, the same jasmine, the same far-off dog. Whatever happened in there happened quietly. That was the gift of the night. The night swallows things. It takes the edges off and lays them down soft. And by morning, there is only the shape of what was once true. Stand here with me a little longer. The sky above Lowe's angels has a color you do not see in other places. A bruised pink at the horizon, fading up through a deep blue that is almost purple, then into the true black where the stars hide. The hills hold the city like cupped hands. The ocean is out there somewhere to the west, hushing against the sand, the way it has hushed for 10,000 years, and will hush for 10,000 more. Elizabeth Short walked under this same sky once. She looked up at these same stars. She breathed this same warm jasmine air on a night not so different from this one. And somewhere in the dark, a story began that we are still trying to finish. The files that burned took some of that story with them. The names of men who paid to keep their names out of the papers. The numbers of phone calls placed from a Hollywood mansion to a downtown office in the small hours. The diagrams. The photographs nobody was supposed to see. All of it gone in a soft, small fire on a night when nobody was watching. What remains is only what people remembered. A reporter's notebook tucked in a desk drawer. A district attorney's private copy hidden in a garage. A son's box of letters from his father, found years later under a floorboard. Scraps, echoes, the shape of a story without its center. Lean your head back. Let the night settle on your shoulders. You are small here, and the city is small. And even the great mystery of the Black Dahlia is small under this enormous quiet sky. The stars do not care who burned the files. They have seen every fire that has ever burned. They saw the first one and they will see the last one. And in between, they keep their slow, patient watch. Breathe in, breathe out. The night is wide. The night is kind. And the story, what is left of it, is waiting for morning. The doctor died in 1999. He was 96 years old, soft in the bones. his hair gone white as paper. He died in a small apartment in the Bay Area, far from the rose gardens of the Sowden house, far from the bright rooms where he once poured drinks for the famous and the lost. He died quiet, the way men like him often do. And the confession, if you can call it that, came too late to matter in any courtroom. His son had been pressing for years by then. Boxes of papers, old tape recordings, old photographs slipped from old albums. The son sat at his father's bedside in those final months and watched a man who had once seemed carved from marble grow thin and forgetful. And in those quiet hours, the son says, the old doctor said things. Not full admissions, not the clean Hollywood line you'd hope for, just fragments, a name, a date, a long look out the window at a sky the color of pewter. By then, the city had already changed around the story. Lowe's Angels in 1940, Seven had been a town of orange groves and oil derricks, of streetcars rattling down Wilshire, of palm trees so young they barely cast a shadow. By the time the doctor died, that city was gone. The orange groves had become parking lots. The streetcars had been ripped up. The vacant lot on Norton Avenue, where the girl was found in the wet grass, had been swallowed by a tidy row of stucco houses with green lawns and sprinklers that hissed at dawn. But the story did not leave. It soaked into the place like rain into old wood. You can still feel it if you walk certain streets at certain hours. The Biltmore Hotel, with its gold ceilings and its dark marble lobby, still keeps her name on the lips of bellmen. They will point to the spot where she was last seen alive, near the heavy doors, under a chandelier the size of a small car. Tourists pose there for photographs. The staff smile politely. The clock above the front desk keeps ticking, the way it has since 1923. The Sowden house still stands on Franklin Avenue, low and strange, its Mayan stone teeth biting the sky. People drive past slow and crane their necks. The hedges are taller now. The gate is locked, but you can see the courtyard through the wrought iron. And you can imagine what it looked like in the lamplight of a January night long ago, with the smell of jasmine heavy in the cool air, and the sound of a piano drifting from an open window. A whole way of seeing the city grew from this one dead girl, Writers built careers on her. Painters painted her over and over, her dark hair fanned out, her white skin lit like the moon. Filmmakers turned her into shadow and rain, and the wet shine of empty streets. She became the patron saint of Lowe's Angels Noir, the ghost that hangs over every story about a pretty girl with a suitcase and a dream. Every January, on the anniversary, small groups gather at the Biltmore. They drink old fashions and tell the story again. Some of them are amateur sleuths with binders full of newspaper clippings. Some are just curious. Some are writers looking for one more angle nobody has tried. They speak her real name, Elizabeth, and they speak the name the papers gave her, the Black Dahlia, and the two names hang in the air like smoke from a slow cigarette. They're our walking tour now. A guide in a fedora leads you down 6th Street and points at doorways. You see the spot where she had her last drink. You see the curb where she stepped into a car that never brought her home. The guide tells the story in a low voice, almost a whisper, as if the buildings themselves might be listening. And underneath all of it, woven through the festivals and the books and the films, is a quiet bitterness that only Angelinos seem to carry, a belief that the city protects its own, that the powerful in this town can do almost anything, and the paperwork will simply disappear. That justice in Lowe's Angels is a kind of stage set, beautiful from the front, hollow plywood from behind. The doctor's confession, whatever it truly was, came too late to test any of that. He died in his bed. No handcuffs, no headlines, just a son with a box of tapes, and a story the city had already half decided to believe. The grass on Norton Avenue grew back long ago, but the legend kept growing too, taller than the palms, deeper than the roots. Steve Hodel left Lowe's Angels in the spring of 1986, and for a long time he thought he had left the case behind too. He drove north along the coast, past the kelp beds and the sea cliffs, watching the Pacific turn from gray to silver to the color of old pewter. He was a retired homicide detective by then. His hair had gone the color of beach sand, and his hands, which had carried so many files in so many years, finally felt empty. Bellingham, Washington, was where he settled. A small town tucked against the Canadian border, ringed by fir trees and damp green hills. For a while, the rain there washed the old city out of him. He fished. He walked the docks where the gulls cried like rusted hinges. He watched the ferries slide out across Puget Sound, their lights blurring in the fog like distant lanterns. Lowe's angels felt 1,000 years away. The palm trees, the dry heat, the boulevards that smelled of jasmine and gasoline, all of it dimmed in his memory like a photograph left in the sun. Then his father died, and the small black album fell into his hands. You know the story by now. 2 photographs, a face that looked like Elizabeth Short, and a son who could not look away. But what matters here is what happened next, because the case did not stay in California. It followed Steve Hodel north, up the coast, into the wet quiet of Bellingham. It rode in the back seat of his car. It sat at his kitchen table while the rain ticked against the windows. It waited beside his bed at night, patient as a cat. He began to write. The little house filled with paper, boxes of transcripts stacked along the walls like cordwood, old LAPD reports, photocopied and dog-eared, spread across the dining room table. Maps of Lowe's angels pinned to the walls, with red string running between addresses, between names, between dates. The fir trees swayed outside his windows, and the smell of cedar drifted through the screens. But inside the house, it was always 1947. Always January. Always that vacant lot on Norton Avenue. Neighbors saw him at the grocery store and thought he was just a quiet, retired man. They had no idea he was carrying a ghost across state lines. They did not know that when he walked the beach at Larrabee, watching the tide pull back over the smooth gray stones, he was thinking about a girl who had died 40 years before he ever got there. The case had crossed mountains with him. It had crossed time zones, and it refused to be unpacked. This is how legends travel. They do not stay where they happened. They ride in suitcases and in memories, in the back pockets of people who cannot stop turning them over. The Black Dahlia became a Hollywood ghost the moment Elizabeth Short died, but she did not stay in Hollywood. She drifted north with Steve Hodel. She drifted east with reporters who retired to small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania. and told the story at dinner parties until their wives begged them to stop. She drifted into the dreams of detectives' children who heard the case whispered about in kitchens and never quite forgot it. There is a man in Maine who collects Black Dahlia clippings. There is a woman in New Mexico who paints Elizabeth Short's face over and over in different colors, never quite the same twice. There is a librarian in Chicago who keeps a folder in her desk drawer with newspaper articles from 1947, and she does not know why she keeps it, only that throwing it away feels like a betrayal of someone she never met. The case spreads like that, quietly, from hand to hand, from town to town, a ghost that learned to travel light. Steve Hodel published his first book in 2003. By then, he had been gone from Los Angeles for almost 20 years, but every page he wrote pulled him back to the city he had tried to leave. He flew south for interviews. He stood on the corner of 39th and Norton and looked at the grass where the body had been found. The lot had been built over. Houses stood there now, with sprinklers ticking softly across the lawns. But for him, the field was still there, underneath everything. It had never been paved over. It had only been hidden. He went home to Bellingham. The rain was waiting. The fir trees were waiting. And on his kitchen table, the case was waiting too, patient as it had always been, with all its questions still unanswered. Los Angeles holds its secrets the way the desert holds water, deep down, out of sight. And sometimes, if you listen, you can still hear them moving under the streets. The names are still whispered, even now, even after all these years. Walk down certain blocks in the old part of town, and you'll find people who know things. Old bartenders, retired hotel clerks, the grandchildren of cops who worked the night beat in 1947. They don't say much, but they say enough. There's the name of the doctor, of course. That one floats above the rest like smoke. People say it with a small shake of the head, the way folks once spoke of bad weather coming. The doctor with the big stone house on the hill. The doctor who threw parties no one wrote about. The doctor whose son went looking and found too much. There are other names too, names you won't find in any official file. A studio executive who paid for things to disappear, a police chief who took meetings in dark restaurants, a vice cop who carried a little black book and burned it before he died, a band leader who saw a girl get into a car one night and never said a word about it for 50 years. The whispers gather in certain places. The lobby of the Biltmore Hotel still feels heavy, even with new carpet and new lights. The old booths at the Formosa Cafe, the quiet corner tables at Maso and Frank, where the waiters wear red coats and remember everything they're not supposed to remember. Sit there long enough and the past leans in close. The Sowden house still stands on Franklin Avenue. New owners, new paint, new plants in the courtyard. But the Mayan stone faces still stare out from the walls, watching the street the way they watched it then. People drive past slow. They take pictures from the sidewalk. They wonder what the basement looks like now. That's the thing about this case. It never closed. It just kept opening. Every few years, someone finds a new letter, a new tape, a new page from a file that wasn't supposed to exist. A retired detective writes a book. A grandchild opens a box in an attic. A confession surfaces from a deathbed somewhere in the desert. And the names come back. Always the same names, drifting up through the years like bubbles in deep water. The girl herself has become something larger than a girl. Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, with dark hair and a soft laugh, and a coat she'd patched at the cuffs. She wanted to be in pictures. She wanted to be loved. She wanted what so many wanted in that city by the sea. And somewhere in those last 6 days, she met someone who took all of it away. We still don't know who. Not for certain. Not in the way that would let the story rest. We have suspects. We have theories. We have stacks of pages thick as phone books, written by smart people who spent their lives chasing this ghost. Some of them are sure. Some of them go to their graves sure. But sure is not the same as proven. And proven is not the same as punished. That's the open door this story leaves behind. The door at the end of the hallway that nobody ever closed. You can walk up to it. You can put your hand on the wood. You can feel the cold air moving through the gap at the bottom, but you can't quite push it open. Something on the other side keeps it just out of reach. Maybe the answer is in a file that burned in 1949. Maybe it's in a tape that got erased. Maybe it's in the memory of an old man who died in a nursing home in Glendale without ever telling his children what he knew. Maybe the answer is sitting in a basement somewhere, in a cardboard box marked with a name nobody recognizes anymore. Or maybe the answer is exactly what it has always been: a doctor with a bone saw, a house with thick walls, a network of friends who made sure the questions never got asked out loud, and a city that learned very early how to look the other way. The whispers continue in the dark booths, in the back rooms, in the soft lamplight of houses up in the hills where people still remember. The names move from mouth to mouth, year after year, quiet as moths. And the Black Dahlia keeps her secret. Even now, even tonight, somewhere under the streets of Los Angeles, the truth still sleeps. The fire is low now. You can hear the last logs settle, soft as a sigh, the orange light dimming into a slow red breath. Outside, the night has gone deep. The kind of deep where the stars seem closer than the trees, where the world feels held in a quiet pair of hands. The story is told, or as much of it as anyone can tell. She was 22. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She came from Boston with dark hair and a soft laugh, and she wanted Hollywood to know her name. Hollywood learned it, just not the way she dreamed. You've heard the pieces now. The empty lot on Norton Avenue where the grass grew yellow in the winter sun. The White House on Franklin with the long stone stairs and the rooms that held strange echoes. The doctor with the steady hands and the quiet smile. The son who spent decades digging through his own father's shadow. The boxes of tape. The letters cut from magazines. The witnesses who changed their stories like people changing coats. The files that turned to ash before anyone could read them. You've heard the names whispered in old bars off Hollywood Boulevard. You've heard about the friends in high places, the envelopes passed under tables, the careful silence of men who knew better than to speak. You've heard about the painter in Paris and the smile cut into canvas. You've heard the confession that arrived too late to matter, spoken into a microphone that nobody answered. And still, after all of it, the case sits where it has always sat, open, unsolved, a folder somewhere in a quiet building, the edges soft with handling, the answers locked behind names too old to chase. That is the truth of these stories. They do not close. They breathe. Lowe's Angels keeps her now, the way old cities keep all their lost daughters. She lives in the warm gold light that pours through palm trees at 5 o'clock. She lives in the cool blue shadow of the Hollywood sign at dusk. She lives in the hush of Lamert Park on a winter morning, when the dew sits heavy on the grass, and the sidewalks are empty, and the houses sleep behind their shutters. The lot where she was found is built over now. Quiet homes, quiet yards, children who do not know her name play under the same sky she once stood beneath. The Sowden house still stands on Franklin Avenue. The stone face, the Mayan curves, the long shadows that fall across its courtyard when the afternoon turns slow and amber. People live there. People sleep there. The basement is just a basement now, holding nothing but boxes and dust and the small forgotten things of ordinary life. The mountains rise above the city the way they always have. The Pacific rolls in white and steady along the coast. The freeways hum their long electric song, and the lights of the valley spread out at night like a great quiet field of stars laid down on the earth. And somewhere in all of that, Elizabeth Short is still 22.